Well, good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. So it's with great pleasure that I'm welcoming Professor Hemingway to give the next in our series of grand challenges from the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences. Many of you are regular attendees at this series of lectures. If you aren't, you know it's about looking at those grand challenges that we face on a societal level, challenges which cannot be solved by a single discipline, challenges that require a really interdisciplinary approach, some real lateral thinking about how science and humanities and the social sciences, medicine and health all fit together to solve some of these big challenges that face society. One of the great challenges that has always faced humans and animals have been infectious diseases. But it is because of people like Janet and the organisation that she's led that actually those challenges are, I wouldn't say they're less, but real impact has been made in some of those areas in a really meaningful way. And I think we're looking forward, all of us, to hearing about some of that today. The invitation to Janet here recognises her impact on global health through the control specifically of tropical disease vectors and her world-leading research into the mechanisms of insecticide resistance in mosquitoes, but also in particular her leadership for many years of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. So following a BSc in genetics and zoology from Sheffield University, Janet completed a PhD on the biochemistry and genetics of insecticide resistance in Anopheles at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she's also more recently been conferred with a DSc in medicine from the Universities of Sheffield, Warwick and Chester. Janet is a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, quite a few others, but she's also a Fellow of the Royal Society as well. And an honorary member of the British Society for Parasitology I see on this list, which is... It's eminent. It is eminent, it is eminent. Janet has led the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine that many of you will be familiar with since 2001. And she's recently just finished her term as director, leaving in January. And she's left a great legacy behind her there, leading over 1,000 staff in Liverpool. I was at Liverpool University at the time when Janet was there, during the time of the realignment of the university and the Liverpool School, otherwise known as the Great Schism or the Divorce. But actually, looking at from the external now, a story of great success for the Liverpool School. I had to check that I had the right zeros on this, but Janet came into the school when it had a research income of 23 million in 2001. When she left, there was an income of over 500 million. For many of you will be familiar, that is bigger than many university entire budgets. And certainly, I don't know whether our Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research is here, but no, he's not. But I shall be just noting that that's a target that we, well, it's certainly an aspirational target for many universities. So huge amount of leadership and transformation of that institution that's made really global impact into the areas of infectious diseases. Janet's very closely associated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well as other public and private duties in terms of many of the grant funding organisations that underpin research into infectious disease. So it's really with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Janet Hemingway to speak to us this afternoon on tackling human infectious diseases in the 21st century, opportunities and challenges. Thank you very much, Janet.
Many thanks. I'm sure all of you are going to be very pleased that I'm not going to talk in great detail about insecticide resistance and mosquitoes. Maybe one or two might be disappointed, but most of you not. But as you just heard, that's where I started my research career and dedicated probably the first 10 years of my career looking at that. what became obvious to me as I'd been doing that was that we were clearly missing new products in the pipeline for actually controlling these vector-borne diseases. And I naively believed for the first 10 years of my academic career that if I just did the research and demonstrated that we had a growing problem with resistance and needed new products, that industry and those out there would respond and actually generate new products. And then it really sort of dawned on me, I guess, probably about 20 years ago, that just wasn't going to happen. And we really needed those products. So if we actually needed to take that forward, then the onus was presumably on me or people like me to actually try and stimulate how we actually generated new products and worked with industry to generate the products that we wanted. And so I'm going to take you on that journey in terms of setting up a product development partnership to bring forward new products, but then thinking, because of the kind of talk I'm giving here, about how the lessons I learned doing that from 2005 through to 2015, to looking at the bigger picture and thinking what I'd learnt really about bringing new vector control products through to the market and getting them into use. A lot of the same issues, the same problems occur for antibiotics, for drugs, for vaccines, for diagnostics. And so never one to think small, as you've just heard. The latter part of the talk then, I'll tell you what I'm doing now. I've managed to step down and relieve myself of some of the administrative burden of running an organisation. But to start really with the vector side, 2003, I think it was, I started talking to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation because I'd been talking with industry, I'd been talking with WHO, and industry in this case, I'm talking about the agricultural, agrochemical industries, and all of them were saying the same thing. There isn't enough profit margin in developing new insecticides for public health. All of the old insecticides that we had for public health had been from repurposing them from the insecticides that were being used for the crop pests. And at that time, a good insecticide in the 1970s was something that killed anything that had 6 legs and 1 set of wings, 2 set of wings, or in some cases no wings at all. And acted as a contact insecticide, and you could spray out there liberally. And then it became clear that that really wasn't a good way of going for the agrochemical industry. They wanted things that were far more specific, that were not going to cause the kind of environmental damage that the old insecticides had caused, and therefore the target product profile for insecticides changed, and the agrochemical industry wanted something that they could deliver via the crops, and was only going to kill the specific pests that they were interested in. Now, if you think about that in public health terms, we're the equivalent of the crop. And so the insecticides that they were delivering for agrochemical use couldn't be used unless we were going to get people to eat them. And that's really actually quite difficult if you're going to go that route. There are some things like that out there. So many of you will have dogs and cats. And one of the compounds I worked with many years ago is now delivered as something that you get as an injectable that goes into your dog and cat and keeps fleas off them for 12 months. But generally, we can't go that route for human beings. And so I started talking to the Gates Foundation about whether or not they might subsidise a programme for developing new public health insecticides, and sold that to Bill over the course of a couple of years. It wasn't a 5-minute task. As a 25-year programme, they give you the funding in 5-year chunks. And so in 2005, I was given the first $50 million. There was a proviso. The proviso was that I had 6 months, not 5 years, to demonstrate that I could actually engage industry. And by engage them, I mean get the legal agreements in place and make sure that we had all of this moving, and demonstrate that we could actually start and take these forward. And once I got one industry on board, I needed to demonstrate I got others. If in 6 months I couldn't get the first agreement signed up, then I had to give him the money back. So you'll be pleased to hear that I did get the first agreement, and we took forward the product development partnership that is now IVCC, the Innovative Vector Control Consortium. The idea was to tackle many of the diseases that are out there that these insects actually transmit, and many of them will be familiar to you. Malaria, dengue, leishmaniasis, trips, Zika and chikungunya come up far more recently. And showing that this was there because resistance was growing. Pyrethroids had been the mainstay for vector control for many, many years, and in many ways they're the absolute ideal insecticide. Very low mammalian toxicity, they act very quickly, they're very cheap to make, and so 20, 25 years we had completely relied on them. So they are 95% of the market. And then we were starting to see resistance grow. So hopefully from the back you can see this. This is just a map of Africa. But the top set there is the situation in 2005. That's when I started talking to the Gates Foundation. And looking at the proportion of resistance, you will see, just make sure I'm pressing the right button there. You will see here that we don't have a huge sort of red or purple area. It's starting to come through here, little bit here, but lowish level resistance. But I could see it coming in 2005 when we set this up. And knowing what I did then about resistance and the amount of selection pressure that was on these vectors through indoor residual spraying and the use of insecticide-treated bed nets, it was only going to get worse. And so as we've tracked this, you'll see as we go through here in the time series, 2010, 2015, 16 and 17, resistance coming farther and further into those populations. You'll also see there's a gap here. So these are models. We're about to publish this paper done with the University of Oxford. But this is all of the resistance data that is out there globally, both published and unpublished. And you will also see that it's fairly patchy in terms of where we've got the data. So the majority of malaria, or the highest levels of malaria, sit around this area here. And that's where we've, in many places, got the least data. So if you look at the accuracy of that data, here's the blue colour. What we know about West Africa is pretty solid. Our predictions we know are really very good. What we know about the rest of the areas, as these get lighter and lighter, our predictions get less and less secure. And you can see that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of working out just how big a problem there is. I'll come back to that and why that's important once I talk a little bit about the products that we've been developing. So clearly we had the problem there. How did we find a solution? Well, no one individual does that. So the idea was to get together not just industry, but the academic partners who were around, the ministries of health in Asia and in Africa, and the people who were then going to have to deploy these products on the ground and make sure that we were setting up something that was workable. And it was obvious to me that just sorting out an insecticide or a new group of insecticides wasn't the whole job. We needed better diagnostics, but we also needed a better way of connecting the vector-borne disease information with the disease transmission data, and actually looking at how well our products were actually working within that scenario that we were going to put them out there. So, multi-stage problem. So the product development partnership set up wasn't just to develop new insecticides, it was also to develop IT solutions that were going to allow us to integrate data. It was to develop new diagnostics that were going to allow us to look at the resistance profiles in the field populations, and it was to actually find a better way then of actually deploying those products in the field so that we were going to do two things. One was to actually reduce the amount of disease transmission, but the other, I wouldn't say equally as important, but clearly important, was the stewardship of those products so that we weren't just going to put them out there, solve the problem for a couple of years, and then we were just going to get resistance all over again to the new compounds that we'd just put out there. So we needed to have a different way of actually putting these products out there and using them. What about the issues and problems there? Again, sorry, I hadn't realised how big the room was going to be, and although you've got side screens, you probably can't read an awful lot of what's here. But there were numerous problems then that we needed to actually solve going through. So not only did we have to sort out the development process as we went through, but we had to set up a target product profile with industry that allowed us to produce things that were cheap. No point producing a very expensive insecticide that nobody's going to buy. That we could formulate properly, and we took on the formulation challenges as well as the insecticide challenges here, that we could actually deliver in the right format, and that was looking at not only Bednets and indoor residual sprays, but what other formats we could actually deliver these in, particularly for diseases, the arboviral diseases like dengue, where the mainstay of vector control products don't really work very well. And we had to make sure that we had the patents and legal agreements in place with the industrial partners to make sure that we could actually get those products in the right volumes out to the right markets in the timeframes that we needed them. We put the partnership together. So the first partner I got on board was Bayer. They did sign up within the first 6 months. And we then brought on board all of the big agrochemical companies who actually work in the research and development space. And you might think that's a lot of companies, but in fact, globally, there are only 6 companies that do R&D in this area. There are more that actually produce products, but not that many who do the research. Every single one of them we've now got signed up as a partner and working with us. We then got the formulation people, we got the people who produce the nets signed up, and we worked with ministries of health in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia to actually trial the materials that we were bringing through and making sure that the products we got were actually working well. So what about the actual portfolio of activity that we've got? Let's fast forward here a little bit. So having set this up in 2005, the easiest thing to tackle was really the formulation and say, okay, well, what's the problem with the formulation? On the indoor residual spraying, it was obvious. So the best formulation for indoor residual spraying that we had used to last for 3 months. Now, if you think about it, when you do indoor residual spraying, you actually go and you spray the inside walls of somebody's house completely with the insecticide formulation to stop mosquitoes that are going to rest on there and would otherwise transmit disease. To do that, they've got to empty their house. And so if you think about it yourself, if somebody was going to come to you and say, once every 3 months, we want you to take everything out of your house and put it out on the pavement, and then you've got to stand there, and some people you really don't know are going to come in and spray your house. And it's good for you because it's going to stop disease transmission. But if you're going to do that year after year after year, you're going to get pretty fed up of emptying your house out. And so we wanted to change the bar there and actually create a formulation that was going to last at least for 12 months. We set it at 12 months. We didn't want longer than that because resistance then becomes an issue if we go further than that. So the first challenge was new formulations that were going to last 12 months. And we managed to solve that fairly early on. So the first 2 products that we had coming through here were 2 old insecticides, Actelic, that's Prometheus methyl and organophosphate, and deltamethrin, a pyrethroid, that we got into 12-month slow-release formulations, got them out there, demonstrated that they would actually work for 12 months. We then developed new nets, because all nets until that point only had pyrethroids on. The new generation of nets that we've got have got 2 insecticides on. The next generation is going to be pyrethroids plus something else. And the next generation on from there, i.e. generation 3, is going to be 2 new insecticides, neither of which will be a pyrethroid. But the 2 we've got here that are now out on the market are that second generation that have got a pyrethroid plus something else. A couple of them have got a synergist piperon butoxide that actually gets rid of the resistance to the pyrethroids and allows the pyrethroids to continue to function. And then we've got a whole raft of formulations here of brand new insecticides that are coming through and new areas that we're going to put them in. So I've shortened down what was a huge amount of work into a very sort of small slide here, but that is all of those chemical companies working with us. They were putting in half the funding, we were putting in half the funding. Having got the first cheque for 50 million, I got another one for another 50 million, and then another for 75 million from Bill. And we also got similar amounts from USAID, the Japanese JICA, and UK DFID organisations, and from AusAid as well. So we now have multiple funders who are coming in to this space and working with us. And we'll have the brand new insecticides going out into the market, the first one next year, the next two a couple of years after that. But all of them will be 12-month formulations, and they will be co-formulated with another insecticide so that we can reduce the chance of resistance developing. So in many ways, sort of, I won't say job done, because we're still in that process. I handed over the reins of the PDP 2 years ago, and it's still a subsidiary of the school, but being run by somebody else there. But it then became obvious to me that, in fact, it wasn't job done, because what I hadn't really understood when I started this task was that because nobody had set up a public health insecticide from scratch, the regulatory and approval systems that were out there were all set up for agrochemicals for repurposing once they'd gone through the normal process. We didn't want to take these through the agrochemical system because we're not going to use them out in the field. Why do field trials looking at what happens to them in 15 different soil types and what happens to them on corn borers and everything else when you're never going to use them that way? We needed to work with the regulators to set up a brand new regulatory system from scratch. We needed to agree what the data packages were to put those through. We needed to agree with WHO how they were going to look at these and how they were going to actually suggest to countries where these should be used. And we needed to work out what the data was that was going to be needed in terms of looking at the efficacy of these, not only at killing the insects, but also whether or not people were happy to have them in their houses, working closely with them. How acceptable were they to the local populations as we were putting them in? So there was a whole new area that kind of opened up with, again, an issue of saying, if we don't do it, or at least stimulate that and start that, we're never going to get these products out there in the volumes that we need and have the impact that we want from them. So the first demonstration of impact was really from the Actelic longer-lasting formulation. And we worked there with the President's Malaria Initiative. And these are data from Ghana, the first country that they actually looked at it. The reason you've got two lines is it's just two different ways of measuring the amount of malaria that you've got. The blue line is using a rapid diagnostic test. The red line is looking at parasitemia by microscopy. And for 3 years here, from 2010 to 2012, they were using the standard pyrethroid indoor residual formulation that they had to spray twice a year. And they then switched in 2013 and 14 to our once-a-year Actelic CS. And you can see that for years they'd just been plateaued with the amount of malaria that they had, didn't matter how you measured it. As soon as we put the new formulation in, a rapid decline in the amount of malaria transmission that was going on. As soon as PMI saw that, and they are the biggest organisation out there who are actually doing indoor residual spraying in Africa, they repeated the data in a couple of other countries, got exactly the same results as these, and the whole programme shifted over to the Actelic CS. So that is now the dominant insecticide and formulation that is actually out in the market. In some ways, a relatively easy way of taking this product through to the market, because we had one major donor that was procuring most of the indoor residual spray material and actually utilising it as well, so a fairly easy market to work with. The harder one was actually the Bednet market. You've still only got a relatively small number of donors there, but the first of the nets that we had actually came onto the market nearly 10 years ago. And then we really did start hitting some major problems. First of all, nobody could agree what we needed by way of data, and what that data should look like, and who needed that data and how they were going to improve it, and what level of improvement that you needed to see before they would make a recommendation from WHO to actually procure the new nets. So at the moment, for procurement, all of the countries and all of the major donors are dependent on a recommendation from WHO. And then you get into a chicken and egg situation, because without the large-scale data, you can't actually get a recommendation from WHO. Because of the scale of what you need to do, you couldn't do that scale of work because none of the major donors would actually do the procurement without the recommendation. And so you couldn't generate the data that WHO needed to actually put the recommendation in place. And for 10 years, the first company in this area, which is Vestergaard, tore their hair out trying to work out how they generated the data and how they would actually be able to take that information out there and get a recommendation. So again, thinking about what that challenge was and how we should actually work with that challenge, I decided there had to be a different way of doing this, because the very small trials that were being done weren't big enough or weren't well enough powered to generate the level of data that was required. And they also hit a really serious problem, because at the time these were all starting to come onto the market, there was an enormous push by the Global Fund, WHO, Gates Foundation and others for universal coverage of bednets. They wanted everybody to be sleeping under an insecticide-treated bednet in Africa. And enormous programs that were going out there and actually supplying these nets. So if you were setting up a trial, you could almost guarantee that in your trial area, there would then be a distribution of nets happening sometime during that trial. And you didn't know whether the impact that you were seeing then was from the nets you were putting out there or the nets that were going on from the general operational distribution. So I sat down with several influential folks and tried to work out how we could get around this. It happened to help that the husband of the Minister of Health in Uganda was doing a PhD at the school at the time. So when he was graduating, we invited his wife over and had a chat with her to see whether she would be happy to work with us on a large-scale programme, knowing that they had big pyrethroid resistance issues in Uganda, and that had been demonstrated a couple of years earlier. We talked to Against Malaria Foundation, who weren't completely tied to needing a WHO recommendation. We talked to the Global Fund, who were completely tied, and made an agreement that the Against Malaria Foundation could buy the nets that WHO didn't recommend. Global Fund would buy the nets that WHO did recommend, and we could set up a huge cluster randomised control trial, pretty much using the whole of Uganda, with 2 different nets that were available that weren't recommended, and the equivalent 2 nets that were recommended that didn't have the peppermint butoxide on it. This trial is about sort of 20 or 30 times bigger than any other randomised control trial that's been done in the vector space. So it was set up so that in one huge experiment, we would be able to generate enough data that the WHO then believed that they would be able to put a recommendation out on the back of, against the background of a smaller scale trial that had already been done in Tanzania, which suggested there probably was going to be a benefit from these nets. And this is just a map of Uganda in terms of where we were doing the trial. You will see we're not quite using all of Uganda. There's a chunk here in the middle that we're not. We were distributing the nets there as well, but in that area there was indoor residual spraying going on as well as the net distribution. In the east and west areas we only had nets being distributed, and so the data that we've actually collected has only been in those areas. So that comes out at 104 clusters. We have about 20,000 children who were enrolled in that trial, taking villages from each set here. We did the social science looking at the acceptability of the new nets and how well they worked. And this trial is about to be published in The Lancet in a couple of months' time, but it's going to demonstrate that we have, in the first 6 months, a 26% benefit of the nets over the old nets, and if you take it out to 18 months, that drops to about 17%. Now, you may say, well, why isn't it even, way better than that? But you've got to remember, with a net, it's still going to work as a physical barrier and give you some protection, even if the insecticide on it isn't working terribly well. So what we wanted to know is how much better was it and how long did that effect last for? And we've now got the economists working on this to work out, if you've got a 26% benefit, where best do you actually put those nets to get the greatest reduction in disease transmission, but also looking longer term at what happens there on what it does to resistance and how long those nets are actually going to work for and are going to be effective for. Which is where I need to loop back to the early map I showed you, because clearly where we really need the greatest impact here in terms of reducing disease transmission is in the areas of highest disease transmission, and that are exactly the areas in Africa where we've got the least resistance data. So our ability to predict, for example, in the DRC, whether or not we should be using the old nets or the new nets is actually nowhere near as good as it should be. But now we've got the nets, we've worked out how to do the data. I'm now working with DRC, and we're setting up a similar sized trial to this in DRC, using a slightly different way of actually measuring impact. So we're just going to look at antenatal clinics and concentrate on pregnant women and children, not doing a general community-based sort of survey there. But I reckon if I can get that working in DRC, I can probably get it working anywhere. And we've now got Global Fund, we've got PMI, we've got AMF, Gates Foundation and others all buying into the way of looking at this and trying to work out now how we actually place these nets. So we've now got these products coming through, and we've got a way of working out how we actually utilise them. And here's just the data showing the impact from the baseline survey, 6, 12 and 18 months, but I just summarised that already. So, never been one to duck a challenge. When I handed over the reins of the school back in January, in fact, probably about 3 or 4 months before that, I'd been thinking, well, what could I do on from here then that was going to continue to have an impact? I mean, I'm still doing these large-scale trials, and I'm still working with the visceral leishmaniasis elimination program in India, but should be job done on that in a couple of years' time anyway, because we're just getting into validation of elimination of visceral leishmaniasis with WHO right now. And it struck me that the lessons I'd learnt from the vector side could be applied across into other areas as well. And so the limitations in terms of that product development pipeline were identical. It didn't really matter whether you were looking at an antibiotic or a drug or a vaccine or a diagnostic. All of the companies were facing the same pinch points where things didn't work very well, or where they were costly to look at, or where they put a lot of time and money into that pipeline that they wanted to try and strip out. So I started talking to a whole range of different folks about whether or not we could develop some open source platforms that would allow us to look at not just insecticides, but drugs, vaccines, antibiotics, all of which also have the same resistance issues as well in slightly different formats, to actually improve those pipelines there. And so I decided to change the world, hopefully that way as well, and look at delivering integrated solutions for human infections on a more broad scale. So what have I pulled together? Well, over the last 3 or 4 months, I've pulled together a programme of 113.57 million. Most of it's guaranteed. I'll know in April whether I've got the last 18 million of that, but I've got 90-odd million already in the bank. With multiple partners, but there are 6 core partners, and then about 20 outer partners there. Because I've got money coming through the Strength in Places Fund from UKRI, I've got local businesses involved there in the Liverpool City region and Cheshire and Warrington area, but 120 businesses in total who are going to actually work with us on this programme. What are we actually up to? Well, it's actually thinking about those major roadblocks and saying, what of those do I know the people who've got technology that's cutting edge that we might be able to tackle? And I came out with 6 physical platforms, 2 virtual platforms that I thought industry would be really interested in and would buy into and help support, and that the Gates Foundation and others may also buy into and help support. And interfacing that not just with the biology, but also with AI and machine learning and digital and sensor technology that was around as well. So this is what I came up with. Looks like a complicated diagram, but effectively the 5-minute elevator pitch. All of us start with small molecules, so you feed small molecules into this side of the programme, because it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with an insecticide or a drug or an antibiotic. You want that compound to get into your human or your insect and so on, and big molecules don't go across membranes. So everybody's starting with small molecules, and everybody wants to filter down huge numbers of small molecules to a much smaller subset that they actually want to take forward. So the first platform here is really holding the hand of many companies, many of them small companies, but also academia, because most people don't know how to do that filtering, and they certainly don't know how to do it efficiently. And I was helped there because AstraZeneca, unfortunately for the northwest of England, were moving from Alderley Park down to Cambridge, but they've still got their high throughput facility for screening sitting at Alderley Park. They're going to move that in 2 years' time. So I had a chat with the senior folks at AstraZeneca, and they're donating the £300 million worth of equipment and facility that they've got at Alderley. They're not going to move it, so that's not in the 113, that's in excess of that. All of their senior staff didn't want to move either, so they're going to come and set up a small company with me, and we'll have a small screening platform that will actually operate from there. AstraZeneca will carry on using it, and they'll just buy into that until they get another facility going in Cambridge. But we can then also put onto that platform natural product libraries and other libraries that I know are out there that haven't yet got a home for screening. So that will be set up as the first step from there. We then, I've got to look at my own bit there, want to start looking at how we do the human pathogen screening and do that effectively. And at the moment, we don't do that terribly well because we go into a very artificial system, and then you find that there's a very high failure rate of these things as you get closer and closer to looking at these things in humans. And so the next stage of platforms are, first off, having a better screening program for pathogens, and that's actually putting pathogens into a Cat3 area in a cell system where you can actually screen directly on the pathogens that we want. And we've got malaria, TB, and others that will go into that sort of screen. We've then got a PK/PD platform to actually make sure that these products have got the right pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics to be able to take forward, and we'll be able to offer that service. And where we're looking at needing to use these drugs in a multi-drug resistant background, we will also have brand new rabbit and mouse models to be able to look at these for multi-drug resistant organisms as well, so that we will be able to work out whether these things are going to work against the organisms that we're trying to target. Then we go on to human pathogen screening in a clinical trials unit, but where we're using a model of putting the bugs into people's noses rather than having to infect the whole of the human. And we can then actually deliver the drugs that we need or the vaccines that we need into the nasal passages and the bronchial passages, and we can screen that route. We've all got this system up and running for pneumococcus already, and we've already had various large-scale clinical trials going through, so we know we can do this safely, and we know that we can get data out of there very quickly. It costs about 100th of what it costs to do the larger scale clinical trials in a bigger sort of setup, but we're going to expand that so that we will be able to put more products through, and we're taking that through into TB as well. And we've got companies like Pfizer, GSK, Unilever, IBM, when I come off later here, who've all bought into these platforms and all have projects that will use each and every one of these platforms first off. But once we've got the platforms up and running, others will be able to use them as well. Clinical trials then, so having learnt from what I've just done in Uganda and the clinical trials there, looking at how we actually improve the randomised control trials and the speed at which we do those, and putting a better platform out there for randomised control trials and getting those really honed down, but working with the regulators to make sure that they're comfortable in terms of how that will go through. Then thinking about regulation, particularly to help Africa, where the regulatory systems in country are not as strong as they should be. The Gates Foundation are going to fund a core regulatory facility, but that will actually sit with us in Liverpool to help work with the countries to actually make sure that they can understand the data that's been generated and we can work with the in-country regulatory systems. And then finally, thinking about where you actually place these products, because a product doesn't actually ever work in isolation. So if you're actually going to put products out there, think about it as antibiotics. It's not just the tablet you take that actually causes antibiotic resistance or where you actually come into contact with these things. It's also the products that you use to clean your floor with. They've got antibiotics in. It's the products that get put into meat and poultry and the other industries there. It's the products that actually go into the hand washers that you use and the soap and the detergents. And so we wanted to work out how you best put different products together to get your best bang for your buck in terms of reducing disease transmission, but also reducing the amount of resistance that we've got. And so we've then got a virtual platform to actually look at the machine learning and AI to actually take data from Malawi, Uganda, and the UK, huge data sets, and work out what we believe is the best product placement for multiple products, and then actually be able to go and deliver those. And we've got the Wellcome Trust, we've got MRC, Unilever, IBM, and others bought in to be able to take those data sets through and look at where we go with those. And we're linking up with Public Health England and the NHS as well to actually use the data sets that are coming out from the UK system to be able to work out how best we operate here in this country as well. So exciting times in terms of setting up a new programme. What I think it will do on from here is various things. Minimum outputs, 273 new jobs guaranteed in the region to actually take this forward. This is from the funding that's already in place. Per annum, most of those are high-level jobs, which matters to the government and folks who like that who are actually going to fund this, particularly in this region where we're usually on average below that. So these on average are going to be jobs at around 65.7k per annum. And GVA, gross value added for the local economy. I'm not an economist, so I get somebody else to do these numbers for me. You'll be pleased to hear. But the GVA here is about 280 million a year over 10 years. Benefit cost ratio of 16.6, that puts it in a very high value for money category. So we persuade the government that they are going to take this through. Minimum of 2 small companies spun out from here, one of which is going to be from the AstraZeneca setup. And multiple links then to capacity development. So what I want to look at here as well is how we increase the capacity in the local area if we're going to put this together to actually grow this into something even bigger. And so my target effectively in 10 years' time is that we will have put £1 billion of research and development activity into the local economy over that time period, against a baseline currently of all the companies who are working in this area of about 2 billion. I think the story maybe is that you can set off as a geneticist, training and looking at insecticides and insecticide resistance in a mosquito. And if you think about the problems that you've got, then you can actually use the skills that you pick up en route to take those through. So don't be worried about thinking too big. You've got to do that in incremental steps, and you've got to take people with you as you go through. But if you're going to make an impact, then going from a fairly low starting base, you can actually generate something that you can get people large scale to buy into. So hopefully that's a story that for the undergraduates in the room is going to enthuse you. And have you realised that the world is your oyster in terms of going forward from here? So do think about the problems that are there, and how you get people to come together, work together across a whole range of disciplines, because I haven't counted up the number of disciplines I've got here working on these big programmes, but it's an awful lot. And what you need to be able to do is just make sure that everybody is trying to get to the same goal at the end of the day. And if we do that and work together in teams like that, you'd be amazed where you can get to. And you can have great fun as you do it. So I think I'm just about time there to take a couple of questions if anybody has any.